Hello and welcome. My name is Eugene Brennan, and along with my colleagues at the University of London Institute in Paris, I'm really pleased to present to you today this talk from Etienne Balibar entitled Critical Reflections on the New Definition of the Human Species. This talk forms part of a series, Theory in Crisis, that's been running at ULP monthly throughout the academic year, which, while obviously making reference to the pandemic, also makes reference to the various crises making up our contemporary moments and the ways in which critical theory has had to rethink its role in response to these crises. One key way of thinking about crisis has perhaps been a way of kind of giving an alternative narrative of the broadly neoliberal periods. So if, for example, neoliberalism scholarship has sometimes focused on political elites leading a political project, crisis theory, and we could think of that of Giovanni Arrighi or Robert Brenner's account of a long downturn, tends to focus on structural dynamics and offer a kind of complementary period accounts of neoliberalism. These attempts at periodizing our recent history also avoid consideration of the long history of racial capitalism. For those who've suffered the effects of racialization and colonialism, some of these symptoms and manifestations of crisis are perhaps less recent than some accounts might suggest. So crisis poses a problem for periodization and points to the uneven experience of the present. The idea that theory, and particularly crisis theory, entails a grappling with periodization was a central aspect of our first talk in the seminar series back in October, when Alberto Toscano gave a paper entitled Fascist Times. This was a part of a series of Alberto's recently done, contributing to debates on the extent to which the present can be characterized as fascists, neo-fascists, or otherwise. And by looking to Black radical scholarship on racial fascism, reconsidered the aspects of continuity and rupture today. This was followed by a talk from Achille Mbembe on Brutalism, his new book in French, which offered a stimulating set of reflections on the destruction wrought by contemporary capitalism, the convergence between necropolitics, technological acceleration, and renewed coloniality. And Achille posed the question of how to sustain life in the midst of such destruction. With this talk, as well as Achille's recent work more broadly, he developed an argument for a critical theory based on planetary thinking and a politics based on repair and reparation. More recently then, Deborah Cowan spoke as part of the series. Deb gave a paper entitled Crisis in Motion, which looked at questions of logistics, circulation, and expanded reproduction in the context of the pandemic, as well as the wider contexts of the history of empire and settler colonialism. And Deb examined in particular how struggles over infrastructure and reproduction play out in the context of environmental and indigenous movements today. So in that sense, Deb's talk really unpacked a kind of key set of ideas we're trying to think through with this series, which was to really emphasize that crisis is an indication of possibility as well as restraint and brutal restriction. The next talk in the series will be from Benjamin Noyce on the 26th of March. Ben will be given a paper entitled The Crisis of the Future. And future speakers in the series before the end of the year include Abdul Malik Simone, Brenna Banzer, as well as other speakers. So back to today then, when Etienne will be speaking about the more immediate conjuncture of the pandemic and its consequences on our very understanding of the human species. To introduce Etienne, I'm going to hand you over to a moment to my colleague Davida Gela-Lasser, who's a lecturer at ULP. Davida's research focuses on global capitalism, social movements, and broader theoretical questions around post and neo-workerism. So I'm grateful to Davida for having organized and hosted this seminar. I also want to say thanks to Kim Lamin and Eric Erdl at ULP for their support setting up this event and their help on the series more broadly. Just to point you out to a few technical points, when Etienne's talk is finished, there'll be a Q&A session in which you can pose comments or questions to Etienne via the chat box that we'll go through. So I'll leave it there and hand you over to Davide to introduce Etienne. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Etienne, for mentioning the theme of the seminar and the previous meeting with Alberto Toscano, Achille Membe, and Deborah Cohen. And thank you, Etienne Balibar, whom I will not introduce to you. I imagine you all know him. Thank you, Etienne, for agreeing to take part in this discussion. And thank you all for being here with us today. We are a lot, more than 300. As Eugene said earlier, please do not hesitate to write your questions in the chat box, although I'm afraid that Etienne will most probably, unless his surprises us, not be able to answer all your considerations and questions. Now, very quickly, we decided to invite Etienne Balibar because last summer he wrote 3 very interesting texts in a French review, Analyse Opinion Critique, which you can find easily online. The 3 texts are Ce que devient la critique, what criticism becomes, Entre l'État et le commun, le service public, between the state and the commonwealth, the public service, and Fin du capitalisme néolibéral, the end of neoliberal capitalism. These are 3 texts devoted to the crisis.
Question mark, David. End of neoliberal capitalism, question mark.
The end of neoliberal capitalism. 3 texts I was saying, which aim to explore 3 dimensions brought to light by the pandemic. The first focuses on the anti-racist uprising in the United States following the killing of George Floyd, an epoch-making event that highlights the anthropological differences that exist in our societies. In other words, the differences within the human species, which the pandemic has further radicalized and deepened in terms of exposure to the virus, in terms of security measures, in terms of the crisis, economic consequences, and so on, class, racial, gender differences, geographical differences, but also physiological or age differences weighed even more heavily than in the pre-crisis world. Then the second text, on the other hand, is devoted to a crisis within the crisis, so to speak, that is the crisis of public services, and in particular of the national health system during the pandemic. And this is an issue that allows us to consider the relationship to the state, the political relationship that can be established from below with the state as the guarantor of protection for the population, thus reversing the logic of the neoliberal turn, which was able to use the power of the state against its social function. So instead of the traditional destruction of the state, according to classical revolutionary theories, or its progressive replacement by the cooperative, mutualist, and solidarity-based logic of the common, Balibar proposed a democratic control of the state by the citizenry. This is the second element for Etienne highlighted by the pandemic, which can also be discussed, I think, through the climate crisis. And finally, a third text on neoliberalism. The question is whether the pandemic decrease the passage to a post-neoliberal phase, or if it rather announces a further intensification of the authoritarian processes of neoliberalism. We will then have, on the one hand, a transition within neoliberalism itself, with the hypothetical reactivation of the possibility of fascism, and on the other hand, a possible reconfiguration of social rights and citizenships to meet the challenges of the present, that is beyond, far beyond the inventions of the 20th century. To summarize, so anthropological differences, the crisis of the state and the crisis of neoliberalism constitute the social historical background upon which Balibar will today interrogate the philosophical anthropological concept of human species. As we know, this concept has been rehabilitated by the climate crisis and the debates on the controversial category of the Anthropocene, and the pandemic has fueled these debates even more. It is indeed clear that human beings as such have specific relations with each other. Beyond our anthropological differences, we can all contaminate one another. But it is also clear that human beings as such have specific relations with the animal kingdom, as highlighted by the phenomenon of zoonosis. So the pandemic obliges us, as Etienne put forward in his abstract, to rethink biopolitics, necropolitics, and cosmopolitics from a new perspective, considering them as a single problem. And the ongoing crisis, the ongoing scandal of vaccines, the intellectual property of pharmaceutical companies, and the arrogant short-sightedness of powerful states, which are hoarding all the doses for them, are a disconcerting demonstration of this, of the intimate relations between biopolitics, necropolitics, and cosmopolitics. Now, historically, and I immediately give the floor to Etienne, critical theory has always looked within a certain suspicion at the universalism of philosophical anthropologists, denouncing the potential leveling of differences that the capitalist system structurally produces and reproduces. And the interests of Etienne's philosophical gesture consists precisely in the attempt to think a concept of human species that critically holds together unity and differences. Again, this was just a short introduction. Now it's up to you for this speech, which promises to be exciting.
For me to begin, can you hear me, everybody? Yes? Okay. So, thank you so much, both of you. I'm truly delighted to be here with you all. I see a number of 382 participants, which is frightening in a sense, but very nice indeed. Of course, shows the interest of this series and these discussions. So I thank you both. I thank the University of London in Paris. I thank Kim and Eric, who struggled over the last days to find the solution to my technical problems. I mean, but apparently this is going to work very well. Okay, at least I hope so. I'm not seeing any of you, which is, I imagine, normal, although sad. And before I really start, I also want to say something as a kind of warning or a precaution, if you like. I mean, Davide and Eugene trapped me in a sense, because they explained to me that this would be a small seminar, and so I was prepared to improvise. What I'm going to talk about is absolutely not a complete or established, I would say, body of theories. These are just hypotheses. It's ideas in the making, which I've been thinking about for some months now, particularly after I had written these 3 essays published in AOC, which you are kind enough to refer to, but I'm not going to repeat what is there, of course. So we'll see how that goes. Now, perhaps I should have prepared that in a better manner, but since we are in a seminar, even if with 389 now participants, allow me to use the chat button, and I'll give you the plan of my talk, which are just the titles of the 4 successive parts, which perhaps can be useful. So the first is called the passive synthesis. I'll explain in which sense. The second part is called concepts of the human species. The third, that will sound grim. Oh, the human species. Sorry, I hope you can. Of 2 concepts of the human species, yes. 3, solidarity from Seoul comrades. Hi. 3 is called the human catastrophe. 4 will be called anthropological fractures. And then there will be something like a conclusion. Okay, so let me begin before the first part with a few preliminary considerations. The first has to do with our use of the very name, the very category, the pandemic. Now, of course, what does he ask? Did Etienne intend to send these to all? Are you dealing with all that? I'm not. I'm not. Okay. So the first preliminary considerations begin with a little interrogation on the use of the category pandemic. Now, of course, this is completely common and an accepted terminology today, and there's no reason, of course, to not to use it. This is indicative. But still, it's interesting to examine for a minute the status of this notion, of this name, and the reasons why it could be objected to. I mean, why objections have been raised. Now, I believe it's extremely important to remember that a pandemic is an official legal category. It's a category that has been the object of some dispute at the beginning, because the World Health Organization, which has the right and the capacity to declare the world or part of the world in a state of pandemic, already wanted to introduce this notion at a moment when the Chinese government, we all remember, of course, that the pandemic began, or is supposed to have begun. I mean, it was reported to have begun in mainland China in the city of Wuhan. And initially the Chinese government didn't want the category pandemic to be officially declared. Despite its very good relations with the WHO, I'm not returning to that. And of course, the reason in large part, comes from the fact that when such a situation is declared, the states who are members of the World Health Organization, so we also remember that this is a sensitive issue since, for example, in the very middle of the crisis, the United States of America decided to withdraw, but now they're coming back. And this is part of the whole system of international relations and organizations. The WHO is a dependency of the United Nations. So this, the fact that the pandemic is declared as such entails obligations on the part of the member states, which are both, of course, obligations to report, obligations to inform, to make all in sanitary and biological and urban information available. And then, of course, what they do to react to the pandemic is also an object of control. Now, the interesting, and I'm not objecting to that, of course. Now, an interesting fact is that objections have been raised, and they have brought back two alternative categories or possible namings. One of them, of course, is completely common and everybody knows it. It's epidemic. Where lies the difference between the epidemic and the pandemic? And in the case, in particular, of infectious diseases, this seems to be a question of scale. The pandemic is global, the epidemic is localized. As everybody understands, this is not a clear-cut distinction. It's a matter of evaluation. But there's also another dimension to that, and I'll return to this in a minute, which is, of course, the gravity, I'd say, I mean, of the effects. In short, if you want to be simple, the amount of people who are affected, the death rates, and the speed with which the infection becomes disseminated. So this is a common name. But then there was another one which I believe nobody knew, and in any case I had no idea of, until through the quotation by a recent French essayist, I became aware of the fact that the chief editor or the general editor of the famous scientific journal, The Lancet, based in the United States, Richard Horton, had published an editorial. This is on September 26th of 2020, so last September, of the Lancet, in which he writes, I don't read the whole thing, this is not a pandemic, this should be called a syndemic. Now we all wonder, of course, what syndemic could mean. It's deriving from the Greek syn, which means with or together. And in short, his idea, on which he insists, which I find very interesting, of course, or very useful, is the idea that we do not just have to do with a single pathology, the COVID-19. But if we observe the situation at the global level and locally as well, what we have to do is a complex of pathologies, because the COVID-19 adds its own effects to other previous conditions or comorbidities, as is often said, which make it more dangerous or are aggravated by it. And the glue, so to speak, or the link between all these pathologies is made, in fact, is the effect of certain social conditions and differences among the humans, the patients, or the citizens of each country, an absolutely crucial problem to which I will try and return later. So the idea perhaps is not so much to reject the category of the pandemic, than to bring in some additional elements which by itself it would not include. Finally, because I don't want to be too long on that, although I find it's very interesting and important. This also, of course, these various disputes lend our attention in the direction of comparisons with other cases of either epidemics or syndemics or pandemics in our history. And here, of course, the list could be very long. You can go to Wikipedia and you'll have a very full list, but some very notorious cases come to mind, and they are explicitly or implicitly the basis for some comparisons that we can make today. So, of course, this is an arbitrary or relatively arbitrary list, but among the important names to be recalled, I mentioned, of course, the plague of Athens in the 4th century before Christ, all the more interesting because it was one of the sources of the political reflections and elaborations of the great thinker and historian Thucydides. If I have time at the end, I'll say a word about him. Then, of course, you have all the medieval and early modern plagues. But before that, you have something that I noticed with great interest is not called, or only reluctantly called, a pandemic, which is the mass death of American Indians or Native Americans as a consequence, of course, of the European conquest. We all know that this was essentially the result of the fact that the Europeans brought with themselves some pathogens, bacteria and viruses, against which the Native American Indians were not immunized. The reverse is true as well, or is disputed, which is an interesting problem. The question whether the European conquerors, invaders, brought back the syphilis from America remains a disputed question, which shows, of course, that the circulation of pathogens within the human species is always a multilateral or bilateral phenomenon. It's sometimes called the Columbus exchange, which I find absolutely, yes, syndemic like that, yes. Look at the Lancet. So I find very interesting. But there's another reason why this is extremely interesting, because of course the Native American Indians didn't die within the short, it was an incredibly brutal and rapid process elimination or extermination. But it didn't take place within 1 year or etc. It lasted at least some decades, and but it had devastating consequences. We know that, and this is another important aspect of the problem, which is that discussing the gravity of a phenomenon like this involves not only taking into account absolute figures. It is sometimes supposed that 60 million Native American Indians died, but this represented perhaps 90% of the population. So it's an extermination, and this is also the reason why, of course, sometimes morally and legally and politically, this is presented as a genocide. Of course, an extremely problematic category to which we may also have to return. But to add to that, of course, that not just one infectious disease was involved, but a whole series of categories. And I have to say that I'm tempted myself, for reasons which have to do with one of the contemporary problems regarding species, to use the category extinction, which is very brutal, of course. And then, of course, the last example on which I want to say one word is the example of the so-called Spanish flu. Because the amount of death by the Spanish flu at the end of the World War I is probably something like 40 or 50 million. That is twice or 3 times the amount of deaths during the war itself. But of course, these are also problematic figures, because the number of people dying in the war includes or doesn't include civilians. And so it's a complicated matter. But in any case, the interesting fact is the fact that in the official memory, I would say, that depends, of course, on others and writers. And here I speak for myself, in a sense. The memory or the trace, to which I will also try to return, of the death, of the catastrophes, I would say, of those years, is essentially occupied by the memory of the war and the exterminist character of that war. Whereas the fact that the Spanish plague, which had something to do with it, of course, in particular, it's spread around the world because soldiers brought it back to their countries and so on. But this is largely forgotten or left aside until, of course, something like today's pandemic brings it back. To give just one indication of the theoretical consequences of all that, if you consider that the invention of the idea of the death drive by Sigmund Freud is an important event in the history of theory and culture, you of course have to remember that this was certainly prompted at the same time by the extermination, the exterminist character of the war, and by the way in which even in his close family circle, the Spanish flu devastated the population. So excuse me for beginning with these lateral considerations. I believe this is not unimportant. I think that the current state of crisis, and at the center is the pandemic, of course, does raise fundamental questions, which are at the same time philosophical, ranging from ethical problems, and we hear about that every day, including ethical problem linked to medicine. For example, if a hospital is overcrowded, is it possible or is it necessary to decide that some people will have priority of treatment and others not? anthropological questions, which are in a sense the core of my subject today, and of course fundamental political issues, both for governments and for citizens. I will add still in the preliminaries that I find it very striking that at the cross point or roads, if you like, of the philosophical and the political questions lies a new insistence on the question of responsibility. Yeah. And the question of responsibility is, of course, a multifarious and complex question, and which involves many different discourses, because it is raised at least at 3 different levels. The question of the responsibility of the species, the human species, and here, of course, we already meet with what Davide was alluding to a moment ago, namely the way in which disputes about the Anthropocene as an environmental change, a geological change resulting from human actions, and I'll return to that as well, produces effects which are either irreversible or perhaps partly reversible. So that, of course, includes a subsidiary debate on whether and at which point you have to, yes, I know Jacqueline, yes, has given a beautiful talk. Whether and how we should bring in the issue of the responsibility or the causality, if you prefer, of capitalism and capitalist structures. Then there is a question of responsibility at the level of governments, and of course, and that is in a sense a daily problem, because it concerns strategies of prevention, of precaution that were applied or not by some governments, preparations. For example, the French government was accused of destroying all its masks or not renewing its stock of masks in the very month that preceded the arrival of this pandemic, although many experts had announced that something of this kind was likely to happen. And of course, last but not least, the questions of strategies of protection. So the question of the responsibility of governments and more generally the ruling, I would say, elites is directly involved, as it is, of course, with the economic and social consequences of this or that strategy. And finally, the responsibility of individuals is also immediately at stake on, I would say, 2 correlative sides. On one side, discipline. Individuals are told, and I believe rightly so, that they cannot do whatever they want to do, not wearing masks, not taking tests if they are available, etc., without consequences on the others. And of course, the responsibility is also the responsibility of care, of caring for others, which is more active. Finally, I would say, and I finish with the preliminary is already terribly long, that the horizon of my reflections, involves, I would say, an attempt at combining a concept of cosmopolitics with a concept of biopolitics in a post-Foucauldian meaning, which seems to indicate that we need to find a new way or a better way to talk or to refer to the human as a species being. And here intentionally I borrow a formula which is very often used as the English translation of the German category used by Marx famously, where is famously, saisir le message, in his 1844, no, sorry, Gattungswesen, yes. Marx's Gattungswesen, species being, although in a slightly different sense, or I move, I would say, from what seems to be a more idealistic definition in Marx's early writings to hopefully a more materialistic understanding. But what remains at stake, of course, and here I also play with the Hegelian and Lukácsian terminology, is the extent to which a certain collective singular, the human species, could be considered at the same time as a subject and as an object in history. But of course, the first thing we have to try and decide or answer is what kind of being is that? So I come to my first point, the passive synthesis. The passive synthesis is another play on words which shows to you that the old professor of philosophy is yes. Thank you very much. The old professor of philosophy is forever buried in his books. So it's an expression that comes from Husserl, but which I use in a slightly different manner. My hypothesis is the following. In the pandemic and in the crisis that is correlated to the pandemic or develops around it, the human species becomes more than ever a relevant unit, a relevant level of imputation. So it makes sense to refer to the human species not just as an abstraction, perhaps even an ideal specter, if you like, and I'll return to that, but something which has ontological consistency, a sufficient degree of unity even within its multiplicity. And it is generated, and what interests us is the mode or the modality in which this unity is generated. I will propose that it is generated passively. Now, of course, as opposed to actively. There's no such thing as deciding or even collectively acting, as a certain philosophical tradition would propose, to generate this common or collective being. In that sense, of course, although I quoted Lukács a moment ago, we are exactly at the opposite, because when Lukács says that the proletariat ought to be considered, we all know that, ought to be considered the identical subject, object of history. What he has in mind is the idea that the proletariat creates its own unity through its activity. So in a sense here, it's just the opposite, and nevertheless, there is something like a unity. Now, the first question, of course, and I skip that, I go very quickly, would be why do you propose this as something new. I mean, is there anything really new there? My answer would be a mixed one. I mean, a yes and no. In a sense, and I'll return to that, the generation of the human species as a passive unity or in a passive synthesis is already what is at stake in the process of globalization. So even Marx had anticipated something like that when he said there will arrive a moment when the division of labor has reached the stage of the totality, and therefore there is no part of the planet or no individual, no human individual on Earth who is not related, dependent on all the others, which shows that the question when and how that did exactly begin is, of course, a question to which we cannot propose a simple answer. But I maintain that something new is happening now. So this is part of the event that the pandemic represents. And if we don't want to say that it's absolutely new, let's say that a fundamental acceleration is taking place. Second, and I come to the content of the idea or the demonstration, if you like, what do I mean by passive? Here I'm playing, of course, on the resources or the capacities of our language. In the Greek-Roman etymology of these words, there's a great proximity between the idea of passive as opposed to active, something that is subi, would say in French, that you are subjected to, instead of something that you produce or do by your own initiative. And the idea, of course, of the pathological. I take it to be an extremely important aspect of the current situation, that the passive unification or synthesis of the human species takes place as the result of the dissemination of a pathology, in particular because, of course, the pathologies and the effects of pathogenic processes are par excellence in our representation something before which you are passive. That you don't want to make yourself the victim, an interesting category of a pandemic. This is something that falls upon you. You expected it or not. You're more or less well prepared. But in any case, it's something that you receive, and you do what you can, etc. So the passive dimension is an almost inevitable consequence of the pathogenic or pathological phenomenon. But at the same time, of course, and this is the whole issue with an idea of biopolitics, it calls even more strongly for a question of the type, how to become active in this situation, or how to transform this passivity into activity. And of course, this seems to require an action, an agency, a politics in which the humans collectively react as living beings to what is affecting them as living beings. Social, of course, but social and predominantly living. And therefore, of course, the philosophical question is, what does it mean to react as a living being, which is an object of very deep and strong disputes in contemporary philosophy. It certainly does not mean only that you react as an organism. So I come to the main idea, of course, which has to do with the remarkable formula that we have now becoming accustomed to, although some time ago, some months ago or years ago, we had, most of us had no idea of that, which is the crossing of the species barrier. It is now accepted, and I don't go into all details, that this pandemic is a zoonose or zoonosis, which resulted from the crossing of the species barrier, meaning that the humans are affected as a species, behind which there are genetic definitions and certain acquired collective immunities, because that's the largely accepted explanation today of the trouble, the disrupting effects of that is our exchanges with other species, itself largely an effect of because such exchanges take place all the time, of the transformation of the human and more generally the natural environment, including in particular zones of extinction of the biodiversity and dramatic changes in the composition of human and animal populations, particularly the increasing prevalence of domestic animals with respect to wild animals. There are now more, the biomass is prevalently domesticated. I take this to illustrate this general representation, to illustrate what in my jargon, which I borrowed initially from the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon, but he's now relatively well known all over the world, something like a trans-individual unity of humans and viruses. Humans and viruses taken together form this trans-individual unity, which is neither something like a super-organism, if you like, because there remains too much difference, conflict, and independence, nor, of course, absolute isolation. The species barrier is as much a place of meeting and combination as a place of separation. Now, if we want to be a little more, is it okay? Are you following me? Yes. So if we want to be a little more precise, but I perhaps ought to be not too long on that, it would call for lengthy developments. If we want to describe this trans-individual unity or the construction of this trans-individual in the singular, we of course cannot limit ourselves or content ourselves with the idea that this is taking place at one single level or on one single plane, where as I said, the viruses and the humans are exchanging their places. We have to take into account the fact that this is stratified. That there are several levels of interaction and circulation. Perhaps the category of circulation is the most interesting, or the most frequently used in the current situation, because it seems to apply, I would say, it seems to apply at all three levels. At the rudimentary or elementary level of contagion. Contagion, of course, is the basic form of that circulation. So viruses circulate, they are more or less contagious. They touch or attack cells and cells or immunodefenses. And in turn, of course, they are attacked by vaccines. And I'll return to that because the vaccines are circulating like the virus, or they represent a counter circulation at the same level. That's why they're effective. Then there is a level, of course, that's the one in which we see each other in this moment, which is a level of intersubjectivity. So that's the level where persons, to begin with bodies, of course, or organisms, circulate and affect, as Spinoza would say, each other, and also, of course, exchange affects, ideas, and so on. This is a virtual place of circulation at that level. And finally, of course, most importantly, and remember the idea of the syndemic and the problem of globalization, there is, I would say, the upper level or the more superstructural level in a quasi-Marxian terminology, but no less effective, of course, of institutional communications. And these institutional communications in the age of globalization have become multiple, powerful, and directly decisive in channeling precisely both the humans and the viruses. And we know that this institutional level is a complex system of the circulation of messages, of money or capital, of commodities, and that it particularly includes a very important relationship to the division of labor, materialized by the famous formula, the chains, the splitting of the chains of valorization. We know and we hear that this has had a direct effect of the pandemic, not only because it made a greater number of people and things or goods circulating in an intense manner between all parts of the world, which already was one of the factors for the dissemination of great pandemics in the past, plague or cholera and so on, but also, of course, because it affected directly the capacity of societies, nations in particular, in this or that place to react to the pandemic. For example, the French had no capacity to produce any pharmaceutics. They're all in India, or the materials are in China. Or they could no longer produce masks because they are all produced elsewhere. Okay, so this takes me back to the question I was asking initially, namely, what kind of agency can we correlate with this trans-individual patient, I would say, not actor, but patient in both senses of the term. Here, if I had time, but I have to shorten, I would ask you to make a detour through the reading or the rereading of a fundamental critical essay or text of our times, one of, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one, of the most decisive contributions to critical reflection in our new age, namely Dipesh Chakrabarty's famous essay from 2009, published in Critical Inquiry and probably reproduced in other places, with the title The Climate of History, 4 Theses. Certainly many of you know that text. And the reason why I find this text so important is, for our subject, is the fact that Dipesh directly addresses, in a sense, the questions of responsibility, collective, transhistorical responsibility, and conversion or reciprocity of passivity and activity that I am alluding to here. I quote just a quick two sentences from pages 206 and 206 and 207 in his essay that you find online without any difficulty from Critical Inquiry. Humans are biological agents, both collectively and as individuals. I skip, but we can become geological agents, so it distinguishes between biological agents and geological agents, only historically and collectively. And then a little further, humans have become geological agents only very recently in human history. This, of course, connects to the discussion about the origins of the Anthropocene, whether you call it capitalism or industrial revolution. He seems to adhere to the idea that you ought not to begin with the Neolithic revolution or the beginnings of agriculture, and also not wait for the very latest developments in the production of CO2 in the atmosphere, but locate this with the, say, the capitalist industrial revolution at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, his problem, as we know, and that's now a problem widely reflected upon and discussed, is how to connect geological time. And here it's interesting to note that the expression geological history or history of the earth has been also used widely in the past, with historical time or historicity in the more specifically human and cultural sense over the longue durée. And of course, Dipesh Chakrabarty's thesis that we all know is that until recently, the common representation was the idea that geological times are absolutely incommunicable, I would say, and incompatible with historical time because the scales are so widely different. So geological transformation or transformations of the earth take millions of years, whereas history is a matter of thousands, a few thousands, and or a few thousand years, whether you begin here or there. And of course, his idea is that this distinction no longer makes sense because the Anthropocene is collapsing brutally the two heterogeneous types of historicity. Now, I would say that our problem, or my problem, if you allow me, is at least partially different. First, because on insisting on this dimension of passivity, of pathology and passivity, I think that I introduced, or I had to introduce to reflect on the current situation, an element which is not included in Dipesh's representation of the collective, what he calls the historical becoming agents historically and collectively. In fact, Dipesh is following, and I'm sure he wouldn't deny that, kind of Hegelian scheme, the scheme of the canning of reason. Individuals or humans act simultaneously, but without any consultation among them, without any plan, and their perception of the effects that they produce is limited, of course, to their immediate environment and to the chain, I would say, of causes and effects that they perceive and that they master. But at the collective level, and if you rise, you raise to a longer period of observation, these effects are cumulated. It's the invisible hand effect, or the canning of reason effect. And what was negligible becomes effective or powerful, and the results can cross, I would say, the barrier of effectivity at the level of the planet. Now, this is not our problem exactly, because the problem we are trying to discuss, I put this in Benjaminian terms, if you like. It's not a problem of the cumulated effects, or it's not only, it is that, of course, when you think of the question of the biodiversity, but it is not only a problem of the accumulation of effects, the collectivization, so to speak, of individual actions over a long time. It's a problem of action and reaction in the present. In the actuality, in what Benjamin called the Jetztzeit. So you could also say, of course, that it's a problem of crisis that is to be addressed as such. So what I derive from there, of course, is the idea, which I leave for further elaborations, that we need to reflect not only on a new articulation of geology and history, but we need to reflect on a new articulation of evolution, biological evolution and history. And that's, of course, where the question of the human species, or the definitions of the human species, the understandings of that category, becomes absolutely central. So a few remarks, point two, and I'm trying to accelerate myself on the question of on the concepts of the human species. So I will skip my first point, which is in a sense symmetric to the, symmetric to the question of terminology regarding the pandemic, although of course it's very interesting. How do we name the human species, and why do we name, or do we choose to name the human species a species? So as we know, there are several competing categories in English: humankind, human race. Human race is common in English since the 17th century as a collective name. You can verify this on the Oxford English Dictionary, human species, and so on. And as soon as you want to translate it into a different language, and I'm speaking here for lack of expertise and knowledge, only of the closest neighbors, I mean the other European languages, including the ancient languages, you realize that there are never satisfactory direct equivalences. We've seen that with the German, Marx's Gattungsspecies. I only mention quickly that in German you have three terms: the Gattung, you have Gattung, you have Art, in the translation of Darwin's Origins of Species, it's Ursprung der Arten, and you have Geschlecht, which is a complex term. It's very interesting to notice that you cannot use Art for the human in Germany today, because the Nazi ideology, of course, made big and virulent and use of that terminology in order to explain that some human races should be eliminated. Therefore, you can no longer use it. Therefore, there are some correspondences. In a sense, the kind of problem that I'm asking today is difficult to translate into German. And now, philosophical anthropology in the modern European era and tradition has been, I submit, dominated by the antinomy of two completely antithetic orientations and legacies, with, of course, their own intrinsic diversity, what I would call gladly their heresies. And for the sake of simplicity and perhaps simplification, I would say that on one side we had the Kantian idea of the human species, and on the other side we had the Darwinian idea of the human species. And again, if you refer to the founding discussions of so-called philosophical anthropology, particularly in Germany, but not only, in the early 20th century, you'll see that the question is largely framed and organized in terms of a choice between these two traditions, and therefore these two manners of understanding and addressing the idea of the unity of the human species. And now, I will not go into details, that's impossible, but let's say that the Kantian idea, of course, is a moral idea. It's a moral idea of the human, or to borrow from Foucault's well-known analysis, it relies on a duality of aspects, or a doublet, empirical and transcendental at the same time. Namely, the idea that on one side, you have the unique destination of the species, of a kind, if you prefer. And on the other side, of course, you have the diverse characters in anthropological characters, in Kant's terminology, in his anthropology. And these characters are, of course, differences. So that's where I largely take my terminology of the anthropological difference from. And if you look at Kant's description, this involves a typology where you have essentially the sexual differences, the difference of sex. So empirically, the human is divided into males and females. You have the ethnic differences, and you have the racial differences, which for him are not exactly the same as the ethnic. They are, in a sense, super ethnic. But for Kant, as we know, this gap, I would say, between the unity of the transcendental or moral unity and the empirical system of differences is bound to converge teleologically towards something which in fact is the end of history, through education and through the progress, of course, of rationality or emancipation of individuals, in order to produce virtually or at the end a moral community. We know through the unquestionable critique of some post-colonial writers that there is a dark side to all that, namely the fact that there are some human groups which can in fact not become included in that teleology. And so they are like remainders, neither human nor animal. Because of course the whole process is presented as a process in which some humans, in fact, some people or some civilizations lead and show the orientation for the humankind as such, whereas others need to be educated and harnessed. The Darwinian concept is a naturalistic concept, of course, and after it was completed, I also do not go into details, by Mendelian or post-Mendelian genetics, it could be represented under the name evolution. Okay, you follow me? Does it work? Under the name of evolution, as an articulation, this is very important, as an articulation of two processes. On one side, what Darwin calls descent, that is, the human or man is the result of a long genealogy in which previously existing living forms, species in the end, became transformed through variation and natural selection in order to produce the human type. We know now, but I don't go into every detail, it's disputed, but nevertheless almost accepted today, that this evolution did not produce a single human type. It produced several, which were competing in a sense, and among which process of competition, if you like, or domination took place. And then on the other side, of course, you have the other fundamental notion, which is the idea of reproduction. A species, the human species, as produced by this genealogy or resulting from this descent, is able to reproduce itself. This becomes particularly important when it comes to discussing the issue of race, of course, because Darwinism could be used and was used for racist purposes, but a central issue, which has to do, of course, crucially with the idea of the unity of the species, is the idea that all human species, races, or so-called races, groups, populations, isolated populations, are mutually fecund. That is, they can enter into the same process of reproduction. Now, the question that, of course, remains enigmatic, which is the place for continuous post-Darwinian discussions or disputes about the specificity or the originality of the human species, and particularly, of course, the cultural forms in which it organizes its own reproduction, is the following question. Does the process of variation and selection end with the form that we are, that we observe, and of which we are part? Why shouldn't it be possible to imagine that humankind divides itself into varieties, races, however you want to call them, which might become new species? Of course, the answer to that, to which I come in a minute, has to do, I believe, and this is largely admitted, I think, by contemporary biologists, with the idea that the process of evolution continues, but with completely new forms, which are precisely historical. Now, before I switch to that and I jump to that, let me add very quickly that the dilemma of the Kantian representation and the Darwinian representation in the simplistic manner in which I presented it is no longer the only possibility in today's theory. Very interesting alternative ideas have been proposed in the last period, which seem, I would say, to overcome or to displace the antinomy of moralism on one side, a kind of symbolic unity of the human species, and naturalism in the sense of real or genetic unity. And the most interesting among these possibilities is the so-called perspectivist orientation, for which I will give only one name, the name of the extremely interesting contemporary Brazilian anthropologist and philosopher, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is, I'm sure, already translated into English, as he is in French. This derives, if we had time, from the effects on one side of the post-colonial critique of Eurocentrism and Euro rationalism, if you like, and on the other side, of course, of the environmentalist, and I'm even I want to say even the animalist critique of anthropocentrism. But and the central idea in Viveiros de Castro is that we ought not only to take into account the way in which animals are represented in the consciousness of other living beings, in the country, for example, the bat from whom the pandemic is coming, represented in human consciousness, but also the form in which the humans are represented for in the perception, let's use a generic term, perhaps more than consciousness, of the animals themselves. How does the bat see the man? Or in his description of Amazonian cultures, how does the jaguar see the man? And who is the hunter for whom? Now, of course, there is here a very heavy paradox, which is that the idea of leading to trying to install a non-anthropocentric idea of the human species, although, of course, this idea will be expressed by humans like you and me or Viveros de Castro, who in the imagination, consider themselves non-humans or animals. And of course, so this is therefore an imaginary construction, a beautiful imaginary construction, fiction, which is heavily relying and powerfully relying on American Indian myth. Now, from this critique, plus, I would say, the imaginary variation, we can return to the biological and biopolitical question of the species barriers. And at the very least, we will draw the following consequences. First, barriers are not just fences with which we humans protect ourselves from the perils, the animal reserve, where all the infections come from. But they are sites of exchanges. And because they are sites of exchanges, they must be understood in terms of Eduardo Viveros de Castro, the author of Cannibal Metaphysics. They are places of interdependency, or if you want to use that terminology, symmetric, dissymmetric, or reciprocal vulnerability. We are extremely vulnerable to what comes from the animal, just as the animal is extremely vulnerable to what comes from us. And then the whole question is what comes from in one direction and one in the other. And the second consequence, even more dramatic in a sense, is the following. If, as most biologists today would immediately explain, you need to substitute the static and fixist and idealistic concept of species, as if each species had an eternal type, with a more dynamic and processual, or even some people would say dialectical, that's Stephen Gould, a concept of speciation. What is important in history, and that was already Darwin's point of view, of course, is the fact that types are produced, but as soon as they are produced, they begin to change again. So on one side, you have speciation, production of specific differences, and on the other side, what do you have? You have the environment, but more precisely, you have what I would call, after others, the habitability or the livability of a specific habitat. And in this habitat or biotope, you of course always have at the same time material or physical, chemical conditions, and above all, of course, other living species, plants, animals, viruses, mushrooms, and so on. So we ought to consider, I hope you follow me, this is the important point. We ought to consider that these two categories, speciation, production of species, including the human, and on the other side, habitability, or livability of the environment are absolutely correlative notions. They are but two sides of the same coin. And therefore, of course, what is the very object, each of them, so to speak, is a perspective on the other. A perspective of the species on the environment, a perspective of the environment on the species, and the real unit of evolution, the thing, I'm tempted to say, the thing itself, as Hegel would say, the Sache selbst, that evolves, that changes historically. Here you have to move to the terminology of history. Within the evolutionary process is precisely that correlation. But that correlation can be observed and discussed, of course, at different levels. The micro level, that's a niche, if you like, a niche. In your garden, in a corner of your garden, you have ants, you have mice, you have etc. And it can be the planet. And my point will be how does it become the planet, actually, and not only, I would say, virtually. So here I move to the question of the human catastrophe. And of course, what I have in mind are the catastrophic aspects, in the common sense of the term, of the current relationship of the human species to its environment, of which the pandemic and perhaps the pandemics to come are one aspect, not reducible just to the general idea of climate change. But I also have in mind the more, say, abstract or geometric meaning of the idea of catastrophe, a mutation, a reversal, or a point of bifurcation. That's the morphological sense. And so the mutation that history, the human history, has produced and keeps producing in the course of evolution, which precisely places us, qua members or parts of this species, before the task, the responsibility of acting. I will borrow Foucault's expression, and that is not opposed to Chakravarti's point of view, acting on our actions, acting on the effects of our own actions within life. In other terms, governing life or subjecting it to some power. And the point I find particularly interesting is that you can, in abstract, of course, raise the question of whether it's possible to govern life. But in the crisis, or in the crisis that is the pandemic, the question is no longer speculative. It's no longer, can you govern life? It's how are you going to govern life? And what are the consequences of your way of governing life going to be? Now here I had a long, but that's too late. I had a long development. Perhaps that returns in the discussion. I'm very sorry to cut that, in which I submitted the idea that the human, or man, if you want to call it like that, is the globalizing species. That is, without the intervention of man or of human history, all the local and particular environments would not become a single unified environment. they would remain linked to one another only at the extremely general level of some thermodynamic regulations, for which you can, of course, and here I'm polemic, you can, of course, invent some sort of mythical name and representation. You can call that Gaia, if you like, as some contemporaries are doing. But for Gaia, let's call it like that, or the planet, to become a single environment where the effects and counter effects of conflictual, I would say, relationship between species and their respective conditions of existence affect each other or produce transformations at the global level, you need the intervention, or perhaps I would prefer the idea of the introduction of a species which itself breaks the barriers, I would say, and it's the only one which does that, breaks the barriers between separated environments. That is, a species whose habitat or habitation is not limited to this or that type of biotope, for example, living in the mountains, or living in the sea, or living in the savanna, or living in the rainforests, etc., but living in each and every of these environments, crossing every pre-existing barrier or frontier, so that in the end there's no environment on the planet, not even the polar regions, not even the top of the Himalayas. Perhaps to some extent, yes, the oceanic wells, where the humans are not going and where they are not producing transformations. And of course, the result seems to be, but let's be cautious, an essentially negative result, as at the beginning. Now, in order to interpret this effect, you have to describe the originality, I would say, the originality of the human species as a species in a evolutionary point of view, which is also, of course, completely historical. What philosophers and biologists sometimes call the process of humanization, the humanization of the human, becoming increasingly different and specific. And I leave that for discussion, three aspects of this characteristic. First, colonization. I'd say that the human species is a colonizing species. Now, of course, there are others. You might say the terminology, social biologists use the terminology of colonies and colonization. Each time, in particular, some species collectively migrate from one environment and try to survive in a slightly different. So this is, at the beginning, not purely a human. In the case of humankind, of course, humankind colonized the earth in a cycle that began with dissemination. Therefore, human groups were isolated from one another more or less completely. For example, when some humans crossed the Bering Strait, the Americas were colonized by humans coming from Asia, but for centuries and even millennia, they remained isolated, and for that reason, of course, created cultures and acquired characteristics which were extremely specific. After which, of course, you have the reverse effect, which is appropriation. Appropriation by some human groups, of course, of the earth. Second, you have domestication. Domestication is a fascinating aspect of this typically human history, because it deeply affects all the other species. As I was saying a moment ago, among vertebrates, there are more living, not more species, but not more living domestic animals than wild ones. So new, and the same is true for plants. So you see emerging as a consequence of human intervention or introduction, a division among the non-humans, which I believe is far too neglected by contemporary discussions. Donna Haraway and others, they are all insisting on although their examples are taken in companion species, but they're all insisting on the fact that we should reverse, symmetrize our perception of the relationship between human animals and non-human animals. But there's another distinction which is clearly as important, and perhaps more in terms of the contemporary effects on the biodiversity, which is the cleavage, human-produced or man-produced cleavage among non-human animals between domestic and non-domestic. And of course, this goes along with what some theorists have called the self-domestication of the human himself. And finally, we have the artificialization of the human. That's where, of course, we jump from history to something I don't see how to call, if not evolution, because what we witness in history is a progressive mutation of the human into what some others have called a prosthetic animal, or some others have called a hybrid, and here Donna Haraway, of course, is very useful. That is a living who both individually and collectively can survive and reproduce itself only in the condition of being permanently connected to, supplemented by technological devices. So progressively, some of them are becoming grafted and internalized in the body. But essentially, of course, they take the form of what Bernard Stiegler called exosomatization. Our body is not only this body that I'm showing to you now, but it's the external body of all the objects without which I cannot live daily on a daily basis. And collectively, of course, it's the whole system of the technological and industrial instruments of communication and production, without which we have no pleasure, no food, no learning, no collective reflection, etc. Something that our friend Tony Negri and others want to call, in a Marxian terminology, the general intellect. But the basis for that is technological. Now, inevitably, this leads to the question, where is capitalism in that? Because you describe this as a history of the human. And I insist on this because I believe it's very important to know that colonization, domestication, and artificialization began long ago, since the very beginning, in fact, of the beginning, whatever it is, of the history of the human species. So it's not the result of capitalism. But on the other hand, I am not denying, of course, that capitalism produced a dramatic change, perhaps even a bifurcation. And I would also gladly use the category of acceleration, provided you keep in mind that scientifically, an acceleration is not only the fact that the speed is increased. If you look at the demographic curves of the human population, it's of course spectacular, but it's also, of course, the orientation of that change. So the question we'd have to ask is, how did capitalism affect colonization? What kind of colonization did it produce? It produced a colonization that was that became, as contemporary theorists would say, essentially based on extraction, therefore destruction of the human resources, non-reproduction, and which was based on colonization in the historical sense of the term, slavery, but more generally the fact that the human species as such has become divided into colonizers and colonized. Although it is important to remark that the line of demarcation between the colonizers and the colonized is not always clean. And I could make similar remarks about domestication and artificialization that I leave aside. But as a consequence, of course, capitalism must be linked with, on the one side, and I think these are correlative aspects, the fact that we are witnessing what naturalists or biologists call the sixth great extinction, of biodiversity, going along with the relying of the human on completely industrialized agriculture, and on the other side, the fact that we have become hybrid beings, and we are hybrid beings forever. We are not going to return. But the question is, what kind of hybrid beings? So this is catastrophic. Anthropological fracture. Can I say a few things about that, or is it abusive? David,
yeah.
Eugene. Yes?
Yeah, go ahead, Etienne. I mean, we're going to go a little bit longer than intended. So
okay. Thank you so much. So back to the pandemic, and let's propose a problematic of circulations, enclosures, and new frontiers, generic divisions within the passive unity of the species. So production of the unity in the modality of fractures or rifts. I think that the prevalence of circulation, on which I insisted at the beginning, is illustrated by the interdependency of the various moves I mentioned. The circulation of viruses and their variants, the circulation of humans, locally, nationally, globally, the circulation of vaccines. But that leads to the question, of course, of how these circulations are governed in the sense of governance. Are they governed? Is the pandemic governed? And here I think that this is a crucial political issue. An accurate discussion is necessary. I think that we might begin with a quick comparison with the general issue of climate change. Because what strikes me, I offer this for discussion, of course, is the fact that the climate change is not governed. It's absolutely not governed. We have agreements, COP21 declarations and treatises, plans for a Greek economy, or a green, excuse me, interesting lapse, a Green New Deal, and so on. And so on. These are words. Nothing is done. I think we have to agree on that, and it's catastrophic, of course, in terms of governing the climate change. And of course, we know that if this doesn't change, the consequences will be catastrophic. Whereas in the case of the pandemic, there is governance. And the main effect, I insist on that, the main effect of the current governance of the pandemic is not negligible. It is something that I would call the withholding or the holding back of the death rate. So of course there are people around us, and I'm listening to that, who say, wait a minute, this pandemic is like a big flu. It would kill a number of people anyway. and that could be supported. There's even a funny argument which says that because of the measures against the pandemic, the flu is is halted in some of our countries. Therefore, less people die of flu and more people die of COVID-19. So altogether, this is not something absolutely horrible in absolute figures. So I hear the argument, but I beg to disagree with that. And I suggest that the rate of death would be, because of the global conditions of dissemination, etc., even without the new variants, the death rate would be considerable or enormous if it were not for the kind of governance that we have. So this governance has differences from one country or one region in the world or another, and above all, perhaps one political and economic regime or another. Therefore, it has huge, crucial geopolitical consequences. China is on the rise, and the United States is on the decline. One empire of a different kind succeeds another one, and they have ties all over the world. And the consequences are not just power representations, but of course effects on the population. Now, the main instrument of this politics, as we know, is the creation of many internal barriers or it is what I would call the politics of enclosure of the humans, those whom Latour called the terrestrials, that is us. And the enclosure or the internal barrier begins with the mask, and it ends or it continues unto the revival of national and supranational border lines. In other terms, derived from Deleuze, the main strategy is a territorialization of the pandemic, which we ought to compare with past examples studied by Foucault in the 19th century at the period of the discovery of the pathogens in infectious diseases. And the most interesting probably would be a comparison with the governance of AIDS, which is not finished. They're overlapping in a sense, because the governance of AIDS also involved a territorialization and forms of enclosure, but not exactly the same. Technically, of course, not masks, but condoms. And in terms of the distribution of the population behind, I'd say, separations, it was not so much based on national divisions and political frontiers, and more on separations implemented with the help of moral and norms between sexual communities. Now, the control of this hybrid man, or this trans-individual man virus, brings with it the usual problems of control and territorialization. What is the legitimacy of the authority? What kind of consent is possible or necessary? Passive consent, we can't do otherwise. Active consent, we agree that this is the right procedure, but therefore, of course, we may also want to have a say on the way it is implemented. And finally, of course, it also inevitably leads to the question of resistances, which is not finished, which can be of many kinds, rational resistances or irrational. But I believe that what comes to the fore and is crucial are, I would say, the differential vulnerabilities, the differences in the vulnerability of people. First, of course, massively, you have the reproduction of class through the pandemic itself, or class inequalities through the pandemic itself and hierarchies, that is in as much as the health problem turns global. And here, of course, we observe, and this is everywhere in the newspapers, but nobody in the government seems to care about that, the compounded effects of the increased inequalities worldwide produced by capitalism, neoliberalism, colonialism, legacy, and so on, and the strategies of pharmaceutic monopolies. For me, this is absolutely crucial. The current predictions are that Africa could finally get something like a general or a universal distribution of vaccines in 2025. Now, of course, some of our governments are eager in the very last days or even hours to explain, as President Macron said already a moment ago, that the vaccines should become a global common good. We'll see if this is more than words. The interests of the pharmaceutic monopolies are running in the absolute opposite direction. Then you have the intersection, I would say, of these class differences with all anthropological differences. It is complicated. One should not say anything, etc., such as the blacks are dying when the whites are surviving, or the women are more affected than men. But the fact there is that anthropological differences are factors which heavily and considerably influence the differential vulnerability, especially if they are intersecting. So that, I would say, and this is what I call the anthropological fracture, we again have, or more than ever, and perhaps again in new forms, have a tendential distribution of the humans into different categories or different zones of exposure to death or protection before death. Sometimes in the same town or in the same country, and more generally, of course, at the global level. And on the margins, of course, and I'm not forgetting that, are the quasi-genocidal effects. Populations of superfluous humans, as Hannah Arendt would say, which tend to be or could be eliminated passively or actively. The autochthonous populations in the Amazons, the migrants and refugees in the camps on Europe's shore. So at this point, I would suggest immunity or politics of immunization through enclosure and differential distribution of treatments becomes what Esposito and Derrida called autoimmunity. That is, it becomes a lethal instrument against the species or part of the species itself, where we see that the moral dimension cannot be eliminated. From what precedes, I would conclude that a biopolitics can be a cosmopolitics only if it is also a thanatopolitics or necropolitics, as Achille Mbembe would say, in the present. The comparisons with the past are extremely interesting. And here I wanted to quote Thucydides, but leave it for another time, because the pandemics and the epidemics are always traumatic episodes which leave mankind, I would say, with a combination of traces in memory and also suppressed obsessions, each time different. So the idea of the human, what the French philosopher Auguste Comte called the great being, as a continuity of past, present, and future generations, has to be slightly transformed. It's the case, of course, in wars, but I believe the comparison, again, is very interesting. There are similarities and dissimilarities, because this, what we have to do is an actual experience to do with. It's an actual experience of the cohabitation, I would say, of the survivors and the dying people. And incidentally, one of the catastrophic effects of the enclosure system is hiding, as if it were shameful and, of course, dangerous. The dead people, forbidding access to the dying people. So I would like to conclude on two imperatives of such a cosmopolitics, which is also a biopolitics and a thanatopolitics. First, crossing the barriers, not accepting that the barriers are imposed only top down from the top. Now, of course, crossing the barrier cannot be an anarchic procedure. I'm very much against that. Kind of, oh, this is forbidden. Okay, we'll do it. Let's walk in the streets without a mask, or etc. It has to be done in a regulated or self-regulated manner, and be based or essentially arranged around the possibilities of encounters, I would say, that we must oppose, I would say, to the system of pandemics. Transnational encounters, aesthetic encounters, political encounters, even if virtual, even if on the internet. And I have to say, perhaps because I'm very old, that I count on the young generations above all to be the protagonists of such a politic. And finally, I think that we must put in the first line of our demands and revendications or claims the idea of transforming the contemporary regime of monopoly, of pharmaceutic monopolies over the vaccines and the treatments into a mass production of generic, a very interesting term, generic vaccines under one form of another of common, that is deprivatized licenses. And there is one authority in the world which cannot impose that, but which could be responsible for its rational management. This is, of course, the World Health Organization, provided it's well governed itself, because of its very motto that perhaps you know, slogan, which is one world, one health. I would add one species. Thank you so much, and sorry for speaking indefinitely.
So very shortly, because I have a class in a couple of minutes, but Eugene will nicely stay a little bit more with you. Thank you, Etienne, for this extremely dense and very rich speech. I would have a lot of questions, but simply just one maybe for launching the debate. Because listening to you, I thought about the question of tragedy, which is present in your conception of history long before the pandemic, but the pandemic makes it even more urgent. So you don't put forward the classic Marxist hopeful perspective of the end of capitalism, nor the despairing perspective of the end of the world. And the same goes for the pandemic. It does not herald the end of politics, but opens up, as you said at the end, other kinds of politics. In my opinion, also a politic of the tragic. So not a form of catastrophic fatalism, but a disenchanted action, a disenchanted call for action. And so in this respect, I would ask you how you imagine the relationship between the tragic nature of politics and the question of emergency or the catastrophe, because the emergency, the chronic emergency, is a widespread figure in ecological thought and movements, mobilized by some to put it quickly, activate consciousness, and criticized by others because it can lead to what some have nicely called the climate leviathan, so an authoritarian eco-fascist turn. And you also talk about catastrophe. So the pandemic itself has revived the theme of the emergency, of the state of emergency, even more strongly. So I wonder what your opinion is on the relationship between emergency, catastrophe, and tragedy. If the emergency is a figure of the tragic, a good figure of the tragic, if this expression makes sense, and more generally, what is its interest and danger?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I cannot start a long discourse, but I said I would perhaps, and I didn't have the possibility to do it, make some use of the great example of Thucydides. And I believe that Thucydides is the tragic thinker par excellence. Now, the whole question is whether whether we refer, which is inevitable in a sense, I mean, the idea of tragedy to a concept of fate, I would say, and therefore inevitability that leaves, in fact, for human action, collective action, only one possibility, or the only possibilities would be at best postpone the inevitable catastrophe, and more likely illusion yourself about your possibilities. Or you can also propose a different idea of tragedy, I would say, a modern one, a finite one, in which the tragic element is not so much represented by the absolute incommensurability or contradiction between the capacity of human action and the inevitability of fate, but rather a gap or a lack, I would say, within the range of human action itself. Therefore, you do not believe in that either in a messianic manner or according to an ideology of progress that, as Marx famously wrote, humankind never confronts problems for which it would not have a solution. This is clearly wrong. This is what we have to reject. But continuously facing the fact and or the perspective that humankind could not have solution for its own problems, or that, to put it in Gramscian terms, the interregnum where the old is dead and the new is not born could last indefinitely. But we are not thinking of that uncertainty, I would say, and that gap, perhaps, between the passive side and the capacity of action as something which is beyond our reach. So from this point of view, and I'm very, very careful not to say anything absurd, I see, as I said, I see a difference. Between the general question of the climate change and the specific question of the pandemic, even if it is, and that's why I insisted. So in a sense, I'm desperate for what regards the climate change, even if I keep the idea that at some point a collective reaction might make it possible to not to mitigate, but to modify the course of the climate change and its consequences. But I have to admit that I don't see it. So I'm for, but I don't see it. Whereas it seems to me that the pandemic, although it has causes and conditions which are linked to the position of the human in the environment that I described, and therefore are certainly not to be addressed in the form of more technologies in the traditional sense. Nevertheless, remains within the range, I would say, of a certain governance. And there is already one. So our critical function is to understand how and why we could change it. That's what I have in mind. But the tragedy is there. There's no doubt.
Thanks very much, Etienne. Unfortunately, David has to leave us a little bit early, but I'm going to continue with questions for as long as you're willing to stay, if you want to do another 20 minutes or so.
No, I'm your man. I spoke too long. I apologize. I know that many people have to live, and I am afraid I was terrible. I bothered everybody, but
no problem at all. As David said, it was extremely rich, so I think it would be a shame to cut things short, and we've got some good questions coming in as well. So maybe I can put a few questions to you, if that's okay for you. And
yes.
yeah,
For me, it's okay.
Great, okay. One of the kind of typical political responses to the crisis in the beginning was the kind of phrase from politicians that we're all in this together, which obviously carried a certain degree of arrogance because it overlooked precisely the differential vulnerabilities that you spoke eloquently about towards the end of your presentation, race, class, etc. But at the same time, you also highlighted how, on a certain level, there is a kind of unity that has been brought out by the pandemic, kind of, even if it's in passive terms, as you eloquently put it.
Yes.
So this tension between unity and fragmentation within that I think is also something that's highlighted by, as you've been hinting in your last answer, the climate crisis. The climate crisis is something that pushed perhaps a lot of post-colonial theorists to rethink their suspicion of Marxian categories of totality and rethink planetary categories and cosmopolitics that you've been speaking so eloquently about. So I guess just with some of those contradictions in mind, there's a few really interesting questions that come up along those lines in the Q&A. So rather than develop any of my own thoughts on this, I'll give the kind of the word to some of the public, and I'll read a couple of comments to you, if that's okay, Etienne.
Yes, sure.
Well, maybe I'll put two to you to start off. One is along those lines. David Hannigan asks about how
David Hannigan.
Yep. How your thoughts on governance might be linked to Judith Butler's thoughts on ungrievable lives in this context.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question I put to you here, and it's a bit longer. It's a comment from Engin Issen, who
from whom?
Engin Issen.
Oh, Engin. Oh, yep. Hi, Engin.
Who sends his thanks for your rich and deep reflections. And he's got two questions which are a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, he says that you said we ought to consider the categories of speciation, livability, and habitability as related conditions. Then you said that for the planet to become a single environment for a conflict of the species, it needs the introduction of a species that breaks barriers. So can you explain what you mean by the introduction of this transversal species whose habitat traverses the planet? And then there's a second part to Engin's question as well. He says, should we really call all historical movements of human species as colonization?
I expected that.
For example, should we equate the early human crossing from Asia to America thousands of years ago as the same as European colonization of the Americas in the 15th century?
Yes.
And then a small point, I'm not sure if I agree that climate change is not governed and that pandemic is. I'd suggest that both are governed, but with different strategies and technologies power appropriates to corporate and state interest in mobilizing.
Okay, so shall I reply now?
Yep, that's okay for you.
Okay, so I can't be long. Eugene, shall I include a reply to your own question?
If you wish, I didn't really give a question. I should say
okay.
It's more of a comment.
So my reply to your question will be, I'm afraid, a little formal, but as I hope you perceive, I'm trying to work conceptually or intellectually with a kind of dialectics of the unity of opposites, where the Aufhebung, or as it is stupidly or horribly translated usually into English, the sublation is, but the French is not better. Is not included or not inevitable. That is the idea that unity and division, or even more than division, fracture, as I could say, rift, are not incompatible terms. Now, you might want to say that this is the dialectics for the dummies, because already Marx explained to us that a society which is a class society is unified by its very division, because the division is what makes the reproduction possible in terms of exploitation, blah blah. So I do not deny that there are past models for that, but I try to displace, I would say, a similar idea to a different level. So in the end, I don't know if I had the time to say that or to read that line. What I wanted to say, no, I don't think I said it. So let's say it now. I mean, it's a kind of additional little provocation. I believe that the current fractures, the anthropological fracture, the combined effects of class inequalities, plus various types of discriminations linked to race, gender, and other. Age, I think, is very, very striking in some, etc. Lead again in new terms. They do not suppress previous divisions, but they lead again to a tendential distribution of humans into different categories. So how to call them if not subhumans and infrahumans? And therefore, this is a kind of new production of something like a race division at the level of humankind as such. For a long time, I believed that, I'm not, of course, fully aware of the fact that the old racial divisions are more than ever still there. Look at our countries, and they are essentially deriving from the history of slavery and the history of colonization and some cases, etc. So they're more than ever there. But at the same time, they're officially disqualified. And so what Foucault would help us understand is that a new type of racial divisions emerge. And I fear that the pandemic produces something like that. But then you will say, how does this create unity? This is the worst possible form of division. It's not incompatible with the passive synthesis. The virus circulates anyway. The virus circulates anyway, and if if our societies are able to reflect on their contemporary situation, they must understand that if you create death zones where people are not to be immunized, of course, this will be reservoirs for variants of the virus against which there is no immunity. So the unity and the division are sides of the same process. They are not separated. This is experimental. If it doesn't work, I will drop it. So second, David, governance and Butler's ungrievable lives. Thank you for quoting Butler. I have her very much in mind. I don't know if you read, almost certainly yes, her interview some months ago in a journal whose title I'm afraid I cannot, Truth Out. That must be Truth Out. She gave a very interesting interview. But the theme, I fear to impose on you my personal, tragic maybe, or pessimistic mood, but it's contradictory. I think that pandemics are traumatic like wars, but in a different manners, because suddenly we have to live in an environment where death is not normalized, not normalized. And so we're surrounded by something that normally, in quotes, we should not live with. On the other hand, anthropologists know that grief, mourning, the culture of burying and honoring dead people is a crucial aspect of civilization or culture, without which the relations among the living themselves become impossible. And so in this circumstance, for reasons which sometimes are difficult to discuss, because there are technical and medical reasons. We've all seen on our screens the people in Wuhan desperately trying to access the crematorium or the cemeteries or the graveyards where their kin, their family had been quickly eliminated. And I'm not making any silly comparison. It's a specific element. We've seen also on the screens, or perhaps around us, the digging of mass graves in other places. I don't have a simple and easy receipt for making it possible, even in a pandemic like this, for all of us to support our the amount of death around us. But something has to be done. Something has to be done because the technocratic and utilitarian logic of our neoliberal societies, whether authoritarian or not, is entirely organized around the idea that this should be marginalized, if not eliminated as quickly as possible. And I think it's a difficult question because, for example, I think of the young, think of the generation of my grandsons. A guy like me who is almost 80 years old can remain in his study for days, etc. Life is not unbearable. If you are younger, looking for work, for love, for encounters, meetings, etc., the first thing you want to think about is not how to live with death. I understand that perfectly. So there can be a kind of perverse convergence, I would say, between the logic of the system and the fact that a good deal of the population would prefer not to see, I would say. But this is this should be part of our reflections on the common, I would say. So, Engin, thank you for coming. Such a long time we haven't met. So thank you for both your questions. I will not give introduction of the transversal species. The one that I was reading some developments in one of the books of the great biologist, supposed to be the greatest theorist of the modern theory of evolution, Ernst Mayr. And of course, after him, there is Gould. I didn't have time to speak about Gould. But Ernst Mayr has a very interesting concept, which is the frontier of species. So I found that very interesting, of course, because it links the idea of speciation and even in the collective form, co-evolution, simultaneous or interactive evolution of different species, with the fact that the habitat or the environment needs to be closed. And in fact, what he thinks is that if it is not closed, it becomes impossible for, I'd say, a new variety to progressively stabilize itself and become a new species. So the frontier, and of course I found that interesting because you have the crossing of the barriers, species barrier on one side, and on the other side you have the idea that if there is no barrier or if there is no frontier, there is no species. Now, if you look at the history of the human species, it seems that what are the possible descriptions? Either the human species is the one that crosses every barrier, except, in fact, the human, the species barrier with many others. So the geographic barriers, I would say, or it is the species that carries its frontier with itself and expands it continuously. So of course, that's not the result of some will, of some decision. So perhaps introduction in that sense is a dangerous category, because you'll tell me you're back to a theological creationist representation. Who is it who decided to introduce that species among all the others, and as a result, of course, progressively transformed the planet into a single environment. I agree that this is a kind of a posteriori rationalization. But the phenomenon I want to describe is this continuous expansion, and of course that leads directly to the question of colonization. I was sure, and that somebody would raise the question: how can you simultaneously use the term colonization in a wide sense, and coextensive with the whole history of mankind and perhaps other species as well, and on the other hand keep the idea that there is something absolutely specific and of course especially brutal in the colonization that Europe made it possible for Europe to appropriate the world for some centuries. So my answer is I want to keep that provocation. I want to keep that provocation because first of all, I think we can less and less believe that the European conquest of the world is an absolute beginning for histories of appropriations of the earth, appropriations of other human beings as part of that environment. It's a very long story. Same with migrations and many other categories we could use. On the other hand, because we realize that there is here a political dilemma, so to speak, we are prompted to trying to answer more precisely the two questions I proposed. First, is there here some sort of teleology, or are we reproducing somehow with a new terminology the Hegelian vision of the history of the spirit, except that we call the spirit colonization? So at the end, capitalism would represent the maximum or perfect form of that, or do we introduce the idea that there is a contingency, and therefore that colonization in the narrow sense changed and perhaps dramatically diverted or transformed the course of the human species as a colonizing species. But the result was not a radical novelty in terms of the unification, I would say, of the global environment. It was an acceleration, and it was the introduction of profoundly destructive aspects. And so particularly, of course, what post-colonial theorists today call the help me, not excavating, but extractive, the extractive character. I think we ought to do the extractive character of modern capitalist colonization. And this extractive character, as some of our colleagues in Latin America in particular are eager to insist, are not only linked to the use and abuse of, for example, mineral resources or plantations. Plantations are especially interesting, of course. There's a continuity between mining, plantations, slavery, and more generally colonial subjection. This is the capitalist form of colonization, but capitalism did not invent colonization. If this is arbitrary from the terminological point of view, I will accept a change.
Etienne, shall we do one more question to finish off?
Yes,
okay,
if you
great.
like.
So Brian Milthorpe asks, along the lines of Simondon.
Who's that? Who's that?
Brian Milthorpe.
Brian Milford, yes.
Along the lines of Simondon and trans-individuation, what should be our response to our technological milieu in your conceptualization of the species-habitat relation? What does it mean, for example, that our crossing of barriers leads to a reinforcement of our habitats in fixed capital? So the ways in which many encounters now depends on internet communication, increased reliance on energy systems, or perhaps with reference to Stiegler's concept of exosemitization that you spoke about as well.
I hope I knew. And I believe that this question has to do with the dilemma, or perhaps the trilemma, in which we are generally caught and with which we are working when it comes to the precisely to the issue of the climate change and the transformation of the environment. So one of the things that I find most convincing and most worrying, of course, in many descriptions, is the idea, or perhaps the fact, that the so-called ecological debt has reached the point where humankind, as such, you cannot avoid that. The inequalities are huge. The relations of power and exploitation are everywhere around us, but the consumption, the global level of the consumption of basic goods, whose materials and means of production are destroying the environment. This is the common. This is for everybody. This concerns everybody. Just as banking institutions know that the principal well, I would say, or source for profits through indebtment, mass indebtment, are the poor. Who has the most the biggest amount of money available? The poor. So the same is true for the ecological debt and the consumption. It's not the problem cannot be resolved by cutting the luxury consumption of the rich or the super rich. You'd have to change the consumption habits of the mass, the 99%. And as we know, the ecological debt now means that the point where the resources, not to speak of the destructions, but the resources are no longer renewed, is reached in something like August every year. So which is commonly described in terms as we consummate every year 1 earth and a half. So and there the dilemma begins, because on one side you have the accelerationist strategy. The accelerationist strategy says, let's create artificial resources. Let's heal the effects of the Industrial Revolution and the technological development with new technologies, which will be more efficient, cleaner, and so on and so on. So except that, of course, these new technologies will always rely on the use of earthly products in the end. And on the other side, you have I'd say the myth. On the other side, you have the idea of, in French, we say décroissance, degrowth. And I'm very much in favor of degrowth. I believe it's necessary, inevitable. The line inevitable if something is to change. If the climate crisis is to be governed, that must include degrowth. Reason why I'm not against every plans of Green New Deal, etc., except I'm afraid they are insufficient. So, but then the question is, what do you mean by degrowth? And you have everything ranging from the ascetic, I would say, prescription, combined with dream, a neo-romantic dream of not only returning to nature, but what some theorists in French called ensauvagement. Let's become savages again. Let's become savages. That perhaps would be marvelous, and except that there are very many things which go with that. But the conditions are no longer there for any return to savagery, which is not a fiction, and which is not a delusion. Therefore, some other, but it's a civilizational mutation. So we certainly need to change our civilization, and that's why we need utopias. Even I said something against becoming savages again, but I'm very much, of course, in favor of all and every attempts at inventing different modes of ways of life within smaller or larger communities. But I also believe, of course, that we need to invent a new technology and regulate its using. So, which means planning, and like it or not. So I'm not advocating the return of the ghost plan in the Soviet style, but I certainly am advocating or presenting as inevitable a kind of neo socialist global planning. Now you will say this is out of reach, because the immediate consequence of the pandemic will be a change in the hegemonic constitution, in the constitution of political economic hegemonies in the world, and therefore there they are not ready to negotiate. Only thing that remains is shouting.
On that cacophonous notes, thanks so much, Etienne, for a really fascinating talk and for your very generous reflections and responses to everyone. So
thank you all.
Thanks everyone for tuning in as well.
Thank you both, and thank you all. I'm a terrible speaker. I never.
Not at all. We really appreciate your time.
I never cure myself. You know, my format is 2 hours, not 1.
Your time is very much appreciated. Just before everyone logs out, I'll just remind you that the next seminar is with Benjamin Noyce on the 26th of March for a paper entitled The Crisis of the Future. So I look forward to seeing many of you there, hopefully. Thanks again to my colleagues at ULIP for supporting this. Have a great weekend, everyone.